Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. It is another sweltering, sweaty day in Johannesburg, where I am, and I'm sure it is in much of the rest of the north of the country. Today, I'm joined by Mr. Chris Hattingh. Chris, how are you doing?
Hi, Nick. Marius, doing well, thanks. Looking forward to what we can unearth today.
Indeed, and of course, Mr. Marius Roodt. Marius, how are you doing, sir?
How's it, guys?
All right. So first, a word from our sponsor, and once again,
from Marius. That's
I know it's the heat; it's getting him down. He is obviously low energy.
He's spending time with us. I mean, come on.
So first, a quick word from our sponsor. We're sponsored once again today by Bitvice. Bitvice says, we all know that Bitcoin is the best performing asset of the past decade, and many people are accumulating Bitcoin as a strategy with which to hedge themselves against fiat currency debasement and government overreach. The guys at Bitvice have developed their latest product, SAT Stacker, to help you accumulate Bitcoin over the long term. SAT Stacker allows you to set up a recurring purchase order directly from your bank account. It then accumulates Bitcoin for you at the frequency and amount that you choose, depositing the Bitcoin directly in your own self-custody wallet. There are many use cases for this technology, from simply automating a weekly purchase of some Bitcoin for your own personal stack to setting up a long-term investment for your kids. Accumulating Bitcoin in automated regular amounts has never been simpler, safer, and more convenient. Try out SAT Stacker today on bitvice.io, and we'll put a link to them in the description. And thanks again to them for sponsoring us. So let us get into the news of today. And I guess we should start off with something which we talked a bit about before on the show. And Chris, I know this is a particular bugbear of yours because you are a transportation logistics nerd. But we finally have some figures to put to the losses incurred by Transnet. So Transnet, of course, transports is responsible for our railway systems and transporting our goods around the country. And the mining indaba has been going on in Joburg, and some of the CEOs of the mining indaba, in fact, from the sounds of it, most of them have been complaining very bitterly about the state of Transnet and the situation in the country in general for mining. So apparently, according to CEO of the Minerals Council of SA, Roger Baxter, Transnet woes have cost South Africa 50 billion rands in lost exports of bulk commodities like coal and iron ore so far this year. And 35 billion was lost in exports last year. So Roger Baxter was giving a presentation to the mining indaba and said that this was they came to this number by measuring it against the export targets set by companies, and that, like rolling blackouts, the situation was only getting worse. He said iron ore, coal, chrome, and now manganese rail deliveries will remain below target. There was this sort of a general theme because a lot of other CEOs were complaining about exactly the same sort of stuff. Andre Joubert, who's the chief executive of the ferrous division of African Rainbow Minerals, said that he had previously, during this year, wanted to move 4.6 million tons of manganese from a new operation, but Transnet could only commit to 4 million tons. So who knows what happened to that other 500,000 tons worth of manganese. And this is, of course, at a time when commodities are doing pretty well. And in many ways, the commodities boom has saved South Africa from much deeper financial problems because these companies, of course, pay tax when they do well. And as a result, so we're not just losing out on, opportunities for business and jobs and all that good stuff. We're also losing out on tax revenue. Chris, what do you make of the story? What do you have to add? What is it going to take to fix Transnet?
Yeah, I think it's one thing talking about the fourth industrial revolution and smart cities and job summits and helping those South Africans who form part of the 44% unemployment rate on the expanded definition. But it's another thing when you can't get the basics of trade and logistics infrastructure right. So because now the railways have declined so much, companies also now rely on freight, on road transport to move their freight. But again, that increases risks in terms of costs with rising fuel prices. It also means higher risks if, for example, a corridor like the N3 is closed down. So security issues, that increases the operating cost for mining companies, other exporters, businesses across supply chains in South Africa. So the risk premium of operating in the country increases exponentially over time as you lessen people's avenues for moving their goods and services, their materials. Given how much pressure the Eurozone is under at the moment, you could really point to how South Africa should be benefiting from that with its exports, with Europe seemingly striking a bit of a different tone with some of its energy sourcing, the sourcing for energy provision being maybe a bit worried about what they've committed to and are looking for other opportunities. So South Africa could be taking advantage of that. But I think because we've done so little to maintain our infrastructure, I'm not even talking about full mechanization, digitization, like fully where some other countries might be, like Singapore, for example. It's just getting the basics right. So, for example, when a container comes into port, knowing how you can track it, that it's there, how long it's going to take to get through the port, to unload, all that sort of stuff. So because we're not getting those basics right, countries like Australia and others are going to take advantage with exporting their raw materials to Europe and the US, China, when China does decide to reopen again. So we've set ourselves up for long-term failure. As you rightly point out, we've benefited from a commodities boom, but not nearly as much as we should have. And again, that means pressure on the fiscus. So I expect in October, with the mini budget later this month, Minister Godongwana will say we've benefited, the fiscus is doing better, but you're not going to see a substantive enough improvement to mean we can repay a lot on our debts, for example. We can spend more on other items, social welfare, that sort of thing. I don't think you're going to see the benefit over the long term.
So I think what this Transnet story, Marius, reminds me of is how, firstly, a lot of South Africa's problems are sort of multi-layered, right? We could get rid of every single job, business killing regulation affecting mining tomorrow, but if we don't fix the railways, they're not going to be able to export it all. But at the same time, it also, I think, it provides a note of optimism, which is that if you can do something like get the railways working, which presumably is not going to be that difficult, at least not as difficult as getting through some of our other problems like crime or structural unemployment, that kind of stuff. You can see a bit of a windfall for the country's fiscus and for our economy in pretty short order. Am I right to say that, Marius? What's your take on the story?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a story of South Africa. There's so much low-hanging fruit that if we just put the right policies in place, we'd see, an immediate bump in economic growth, which would translate into more money in people's pockets, more people actually working, and so on, and all that means. But also, just on the point of railways, I mean, the fact that companies have to use trucks and so on instead of railways has all kinds of other costs. I'm sure there's lots of people who listen to the show now will be able to tell you about stories where they've driven on absolutely horrendous roads. I know a couple of years ago, I was driving to Pilgrim's Rest, and we left the N4, which is a pretty good highway, to go to Pilgrim's Rest. And that was a road used a lot by coal trucks and so on. And it was absolutely, I mean, we just driving an ordinary car, but you actually needed a 4x4 and if you're going more than 20 k's an hour. And trucks absolutely just bombed it down that road, probably going 80, 100 k's an hour, which causes danger for just normal people on the road, but it's also, all kinds of other costs to people's vehicles, to ordinary vehicles.
There've been a number of videos and things coming out of absolutely horrific truck-involved accidents in recent months. There was one of a truck that plowed through a whole bunch of stuck cars. When there was another blockage on the road, there was another one where a truck ran over a bunch of cars. I mean, getting the trucks off the road, I think, would actually save quite a lot of lives.
No, exactly. I mean, look, and obviously there's nothing wrong with transporting by trucks and so on, but I mean, there's much cheaper to use rail, as I understand it. And I believe also South Africa still actually has a very, quite a big rail network still. Even though obviously we've lost a lot of rail capacity, a lot of the rail lines still exist, and they just have to be used. But just on the issue of mining in Indaba, I just saw a tweet this morning that Gwedi Mantashe was supposed to be at the mining in Indaba, but he said at the last minute that no, he's not coming, but they'll send some junior official. And I think it's Bernard Swanepoel who organizes this mining in Indaba. But he said, no, sorry, it's fine. Don't bother coming. But that also tells you something about the attitude of the government to an important industry like mining. Of course, mining is a lot smaller than it used to be. It's not the economic contributor that it was 20 or 30 years ago. But it's still, a lot of people still work in mining and can still contribute to the economy. There's lots of multipliers from mining, lots of services around it, and, technological advantages from having mining in the country and so on. It just shows you, it tells you the attitude of the government to important industries which create jobs and so on. They're not seen as benefits to the country. They're seen more as enemies. And that's why we have a 1% economic growth rate. That's why we have 40% of people unemployed. That's why South Africa's been getting poorer every year since about 2011, I think. So, I think, Chris, you always put on Twitter when there's bad piece of news comes out, ideology leads to policies, leads to consequences. And I think that's part of this as well.
Chris, any final things to add before we move on?
Just for any listeners who will read about purported reform in railways, especially. So a 2-year pilot period with 16 slots now on some of the most important railway networks around the country, but with the caveat that Transnet remains the custodian of that infrastructure. So they're inviting private sector investment, capital formation, but they remain the custodian. So are you really going to throw millions and billions into upgrading infrastructure if Transnet can at any point take that infrastructure away and do what they like with it, give it to their preferred bidders, to preferred companies? So talk of reform, but again, when you read the nub and the details thereof, it doesn't actually shake out to real privatization.
No, exactly. And as usual with a lot of these government reform plans, the devil's in the details. In this case, very much the devil is in the details. All right, let's move on to our next story. And of course, this is related to the first. Marius, I can't remember. I think it's you who always has that great quote memorized about how South Africa moves forward with windfalls and then sort of stumbles along. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it was the Kivett, an historian from the 40s, I think. He said, South Africa advances by economic windfalls and regresses by political disasters. I think something like that.
Indeed. And I think we've been saved from a much steeper financial situation by some of these commodity booms. But the good times, as I'm sure everyone knows who's been watching the news of the last year, are ending in many respects. The World Bank has this week cut its economic growth forecast for the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, which often has some pretty fast-growing economies. One thinks of Ethiopia, for example, before its current bout of civil war, where it was growing at around 10%. There are other countries in Africa which have been doing pretty well. However, this year it looks like it's only sub-Saharan Africa on average is only going to grow about 3.3% economically. And this is down from 3.6, which is already not a great number. And there's concerns that there is going to be rising hunger and stagflation problems across the African continent. The World Bank also estimates that South Africa's growth for the next 3 years will remain below 2%. And that might also be optimistic, because I think that this forecast was probably mostly calculated before, for example, I think we're currently in our longest period of continuous load shedding. Correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen, but I think I'm correct in saying that. Anyway, the World Bank went on to say global headwinds are slowing Africa's economic growth as countries continue to contend with rising inflation, hindering progress on poverty reduction. The risk of stagflation, which is when you get no growth and high inflation, comes at a time when high interest rates and debt are forcing African governments to make difficult choices as they try to protect people's jobs, purchasing power, and development gains. Chris, let me start with you again. This is not particularly surprising, and this is, I suppose, a lesson for why you need to have good policy in the good years, so that when the bad years come, you can kind of weather them. What do you make of the story?
Yeah, absolutely. Trying to set yourself up regardless of what might happen globally. Of course, no country can control 100% what happens globally, but you can set up some risk mitigating factors, at least if you look at just South Africa as, again, the most prescient example with our lack of reliable electricity that has basically hollowed out our manufacturing and industrial capacity. So we're more exposed to imported inflation because we import more products. We're more reliant on goods coming in. So when our currency does weaker, when inflation is higher, we pay more for imported goods. If we'd had maybe competition in electricity, we would have access to cheaper electricity, more manufacturing, more mining, that sort of thing. Yeah, pretty bad news for the African continent, but not particularly surprising. I guess the array of hope is different policy directions, things like the Africa Free Trade Area and others, which are looking to not reshore supply chains, but just make them a bit more robust and make sure that African countries can trade more with each other versus with countries just in other areas around the world, so you can get more local economic activity going. Maybe that'll mitigate some of these external factors. You run into issues where maybe some governments have spent more than they should have in the past, so their currencies are weaker now as the dollar continues to strengthen. So again, they can't spend as much as they used to, which means fewer welfare programs. Very delicate balance needing to be struck at this point in time, and government's going to be under more pressure by the populace to call for spending and stimulus and that sort of thing, and various forms of support as consumers are under pressure. So can governments weather that particular storm and resist the urge to just spend their way out of trouble, versus getting the growth fundamentals right, getting things like education, electricity provision, trade infrastructure, maybe seeking to simplify matters when you want to trade with each other, simplifying bureaucratic processes, that sort of thing. We're at this point, I think, where it could go could get a lot worse, or if you get some of these basics right, you can see the steady trend going in the right direction. But it's going to be up to bigger African governments, I think, especially to set the tone for the countries around them. And I don't know if the political will exists at this point in time, especially from a country like South Africa, which given the last 10 years, hasn't, for example, put pressure on countries like Zimbabwe to get the right things in place. Never mind getting the things in place themselves.
No, definitely. And of course, it's worth reflecting on the fact that big spending for African countries, including South Africa, is always a bit more risky. You know, the US and Germany and the UK can often get away with a little bit of bad habits and bad spending and printing money here and there because they're such massive economies, so important to the world. But when a relatively minor economy like South Africa's or one of these smaller African countries spends their money badly, it can get very out of control very quickly. So you need to be a lot more prudent. As Zambia shows, and they're now having to do an awful lot of work to rescue themselves from the deep financial hole that was created prior to President Hikalema's assumption of power. Anyway, Marius, what do you make of this story? Do you have anything to add to what Chris has said here?
Yeah, I think something just to point out is that the World Bank's predicting South Africa is going to grow by 1.9% this year, which, I mean, we can all agree that's far too low. We need to be growing at, say, 5-6% if we really want to be making a dent in poverty and unemployment and so on. But the World Bank's prediction or forecast for advanced economies for their annual growth for this year is 2.6%. So it just shows you South Africa is like a much smaller economy coming from a lower base and so on. We can't even grow at 2% a year. Just as I was saying earlier, you know, there's so much low-hanging fruit that we'd be easily able to, you know, boost an extra percentage point of growth onto the South African economy. And also, I mean, it's similar to the issue of compounding interest. Say since 1994, the South African economy had grown by 1 percentage point more each year than it did in reality. So say in the noughties, we were getting 6% growth instead of 5%. Under Zuma, we say we're getting 2% instead of 1% or whatever it was. The economy would probably be, you know, in the nearly 30 years, would probably be 20 or 30% bigger than it is now. So just these small things that can be done, they have really big effects down the line. If we were growing at 3% now instead of 2%, then as I say, then things would be much better in about 2040, whatever the case is, far fewer people in poverty, you know, more jobs, and just obviously the dignity that comes from actually having a job instead of relying on the state and others and so on. So yeah, it's all pretty depressing, but I mean, I don't think any of us are surprised. And as you're saying, I mean, South Africa is pretty lucky that we have some commodities that the rest of the world wants. But I mean, with the slowdown in global growth in Europe and China especially, that could also not be the kind of rabbit in hat that we've relied on in the past.
Right, and we need to get our ducks in a row, so to speak, for when the next windfalls come, because they will come again. And next time, that can be the engine which drives the country out of its current economic malaise.
Nick, when we have the next commodity boom, will be when we have a EFF government, so it probably won't help us.
Don't be so pessimistic, Marius. Chris, any final thing to add?
No, I think you guys are exactly right. And one talks about low-hanging fruit. It's interesting that we seem to be so blessed with natural sort of materials and goods and that sort of thing, but we can't take advantage of getting those out and to the country's benefit. So I wonder, it's not really the curse of too abundant commodities, but maybe a case of just assuming that there'll always be this kind of demand. But I don't think globalization is going away. We're still going to be interconnected with other countries. So don't assume that just because things are going to more isolationist route now, there still won't be demand and opportunities for us elsewhere. And we have to take advantage of those. For any exporters, I think in South Africa, if they can look at places like Namibia, Maputo, getting their goods out to the rest of the world through there instead of South African ports, they'll benefit a lot more. And at least they'll be able to grow their businesses and communities around them instead of relying on the government for growth opportunities.
Can I just come in on that point? Russell Lambert, an economist who has some links to the Institute of Race Relations, shared an interesting post on Twitter showing that our manufacturing is the same level as it was in 1998. But on that point, though, I tended to talk about Roodt a couple of years ago, no relation, by the way. And he had a chart showing the kind of things we exported to Europe and North America and China and so on. It was all raw materials. And then he showed what we export to the rest of Africa, and it was all finished goods. It's things like cars and fridges, white goods, and all that kind of stuff. And that is where we actually have to concentrate on. That's where we can add value and so on. And that's why, hopefully this African free trade area is a success and something that could really benefit South Africa. But we obviously, it's not going to fall into our laps. We have to build up our manufacturing capacity. We have to make sure that we can get goods to the rest of Africa, and we have to make sure that they're good quality goods and so on at reasonable prices. So it's not easy, but it's definitely something South Africa should be looking at.
All right, let's very briefly go over some of the coalition news from around the country. The first is that there's an impending legal challenge now for the coalition government, which is an ANC coalition government in Knysna, where the DA says that the ANC government there is deploying their political cronies to come to the council with generous pay packets funded by Knysna ratepayers. This is according to the DA, quote, 6 political appointments have been made without any due process at an unbudgeted cost of 3 million rand per annum. Neither the council's recruitment process nor the selection process was followed. Knysna is a very hotly contested municipality. There's 2 significant independent parties there, which both hold some seats. Then there's the DA, which is, I think, the single largest party, but doesn't have a majority by itself. And then you've got the PA, the ANC, one of the independent parties, and the EFF, all together in a coalition in that municipality. Marius, what do you make of this? Sorry, just to complete this point. The DA lost control of this municipality after a number of motions of no confidence in the mayor, deputy mayor, speaker, and chief whip during a council meeting in August of this year. Marius, what do you make of all this? It's once again we're seeing legal processes being brought into coalition battles for control of local government.
Now, look, I think it's something we're going to have to get used to over the next couple of years. I think we're going to see these kind of unstable coalitions. And it's something it's not anything that's going away. Our proportional representation system lends itself to coalitions. The fact that we've had a dominant party like the ANC with our proportional representation system has actually been an outlier, or it's something, it's quite unexpected in proportional representation countries. And when the ANC finally loses majority at national level, whether it's 2024 or 2029, coalitions are going to be the order of the day. It's going to be not very often that any place is governed outright by one party, whether nationally or various municipalities and so on. So we need to get used to this kind of thing. But I think also South African political parties need to become a bit more mature. And I'm talking across the board here. The reason that coalitions work in Europe and so on is because at the outset, the various parties agree on what they want from the coalition, and these coalitions are always pretty stable. They generally last the distance, right, and so on.
There have been attempts to do that this time, but
yes,
as
exactly.
you can see, that hasn't worked out.
But that's why we need our political parties to grow up. The fact that Joburg keeps changing hands and other municipalities, the people who suffer the most at the end of the day are the residents of the places that stay there. So, and we're probably going to see that now in Joburg with, changing, and a lot of senior officials will be moved around because they're linked to certain political parties and all that kind of thing. So, it's nothing that's going to go away soon, but I think the common element in a lot of this has been the Patriotic Alliance. And I think they are probably going to burn themselves quite badly by allowing the ANC back into a lot of places, as they've done in Knysna and now Johannesburg. So, yeah, it's going to be an interesting couple of years. And I think if you people like us, you enjoy watching politics, it's pretty great. But also, if you people like us that live in South Africa, it's also not that great because it lends itself to lots of instability and so on. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we see Nasna go back to the DA at some point. Joburg will probably go back to the DA at some point. So yeah, it's there's not much you can say except hold on to your hats, I suppose.
At the same time, in Johannesburg, where the former mayor, or arguably current mayor, depending on whose point of view you take, Mpho Phalatse from the DA is taking the ANC mayor, or not appointed mayor, to court because they say that proper procedure was not followed in the motion of no confidence and appointment of the new mayor. During some of these, the media statements around this, Mpho Phalatse called the ANC corrupt. And now the ANC claims that it is giving Mpho Phalatse 48 hours to apologize for calling the party corrupt. And it says if she does not meet the deadline, it will consider legal action. This according to the ANC spokesperson in Johannesburg, saying that she has defamed the party's character. Chris, what do you make of this?
Not to be a collectivist, but I don't think the ANC has a character to defame anymore. I mean, take that as the first point. Look, I don't know, trying to get some discussion going. Maybe the spokesperson tried to now say, I don't know, striking this tone that this new ANC-led government is going to really take things to hand and we're serious and we're not corrupt and, we're going to really turn things around. But honestly, for anyone representing the party to come out with a statement, never mind after state capture, but after what happened during a global pandemic, with corruption and looting, is quite hilarious and false on the face of it. I do think it's going to generate a lot of, I don't know, good PR for other parties. They should really jump on this and use it to their advantage to generate some talking points. But I guess, yeah, it points to the disconnect between how some of the representatives of the ANC view the party versus people's experienced reality on the ground.
All right, let's move on to our last story for today, and this is by far the best one. And it involves a number of tweets made by what at that time was the head of Uganda's army, land forces, but is now the former head of Uganda's land forces, who also happens to be the son of Uganda's president. So I'm not going to embarrass myself by mispronouncing their names, but this general, he went on Twitter to muse about various political developments across East Africa. He was speaking about former Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta, and he said, quote, "My only problem with my beloved big brother, that is Kenyatta, is that he didn't stand for a third term," which is constitutionally not allowed in Kenya, I believe. He would have won easily. And then he went on to say to his followers that we could invade Kenya. It wouldn't take us, my army and me, 2 weeks to capture Kenya's capital, Nairobi. This, as you can imagine, when the head of the army says this about a neighboring country, caused quite a bit of an uproar, people accusing him of being reckless and threatening to invade another sovereign country and warmongering, which caused him to reply, "Relax. I would never beat up the Kenyan army because my father told me never to attempt it. So our people in Kenya should relax." This forced a flurry of diplomatic activity from Kenya's government, where the president had to immediately sack him as head of the armed forces, although it kept him as a military advisor. Also, it issued a statement saying it treasured its strong brotherly relations and bilateral relations with Kenya, and apologized, saying, "I ask our Kenyan brothers and sisters to forgive us for the tweets sent by the general. It's not correct for public officers, be they civilian or military, to comment or interfere in any way." The general then went on also to muse that he really likes Italy's new prime minister, and he's decided that he is willing to pay a bride price of 100 cattle in order to get her attention. He said, quote, "I know Europeans give girls they like flowers. I've never understood it. In our culture, you give a girl you like a cow." Chris, what do you think his chances for success are in winning the hearts of Italy's prime minister?
I mean, I think I'd give more than 100 cattle for the Italian prime minister. I mean, come on, like, have you heard her pronounce on ideological and policy matters? Get serious.
Yeah, he described her as, quote, "fearless and true."
Hey, here we go. I mean, what more do you want in a wife going forward? Yeah, look, maybe we should take a bet on that instead of betting on the coalitions in 2024 and how things are going to shake out. We should bet on whether he's going to be successful in this endeavor. Quite something.
Marius, what do you make of this whole mess?
Well, I think it just shows that South Africans don't have a monopoly on embarrassing politicians. And there's also, let's not forget that Uganda is a former this. They did invade Tanzania in the 1970s. They got a bloody nose, but that's also because they had somebody called Idi Amin running the place at the time. So, but yeah, let's see what happens.
Yeah, embarrassing. And also, yet, what if you needed another example for why nepotism at the highest levels of government is not a particularly good idea? Having the president's son be the head of the armed forces is probably not a great plan. Anyway, that's all the time we have for this week. We will be back next week, although I won't be here on Monday. The show will be hosted by Saragon because I'll be on leave. So anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you then. Cheers, everyone.